2 hours actually, almost. So, what would be the main, because I don't believe that people reading Habermas find it uncontroversial. I believe that everyone has an issue with Habermas of some kind. So if we maybe just collect those voices and start with that.
I want to ask something.
Go ahead.
It's concerning just this question of violence. But for example, violence against women. Is it because it's like a private, but it's not. So does he like write about it? And the second question is about the question of responsibility, like in public sphere. Does he write about it something?
So if you start with responsibility, I go for the violence against women.
Violence against women is a main controversy raised from the point of view of feminist critique. I think that Sfera is the main author who pointed out that the division between ethics, so good life it is, between ethics and justice is invalid, I would say. So she points out that such a problem like domestic violence, it's not a private thing. That's obvious. That is a public question, and it deserves an analysis in this field, I think. Ale nie wiem, nie zrozumiałem pytania jakby w sensie takim istotowym.
No, I don't think we should speak Polish.
Bo drugiego pytania nie zrozumiałem co do istoty. Jakby o jaką odpowiedzialność chodzi?
O odpowiedzialność publiczną, czy osoba, która jest częścią społeczeństwa i jakoś tam działa w tej przestrzeni publicznej,
Czy chodzi o ograniczenia wolności w sferze publicznej, czy jakiś inny kontekst?
Tak. O ograniczeniu wolności, o jakimś dobrowolnym braniu na siebie tej odpowiedzialności.
To może ja dokończę tą violence i potem przejdziemy do odpowiedzialności. Okay, so continuing with the violence against women question, which I think is super pertinent and we should discuss it. Also because within the art production, public art, and the concerns that the Polish public raises about, or sometimes even against, the public art, we have this issue, but also there is the controversy which is a little bit apart from the arts, which is, for instance, the question of the European Convention against violence against women and how it is being discussed in Poland. So I think this, the issue of gender, let's start with the gender in Habermas. We already know it's missing. It was Seyla Ben-Habib who pointed to it. By the way, with Seyla Ben-Habib, it's that I think she has a wider concern concerning the others. So this is her starting point, and then she goes into women, immigrants, foreigners, people of color, non-Europeans, etc., etc. So she has a larger umbrella. But Seyla Ben-Habib is one of those authors who, within the feminist debates, preserves the private and the distinction between the public and the private. So she's partly a liberal feminist theorist. So her controversy with Habermas is far smaller, although she would of course point to the domestic violence against women as a public issue. But her controversy here is much smaller than, for instance, Nancy Fraser already, who, without, I believe, well, she explicitly points to Habermas that he simply doesn't consider domestic violence as an aspect of human life, which might be pertinent within the public debate and participation of public debate. On the other hand, after Habermas, we have another generation of the Frankfurt School with people like Axel Honneth. So in his writings, if you look at his major book concerning recognition, his concept of recognition, this is super fantastic from a feminist perspective, I think, and very unrecognized by feminist authors. Because we know, in the feminist studies, we know Habermas mainly from the controversy with Nancy Fraser about recognition versus redistribution, right? So this is the context where Honneth is somehow brought into feminist discussions, and there we have a super simplistic and very reductive vision of Honneth as somebody who, again, like all the other masculine theorists from the critical theory school, just neglect the gender issues and don't think about the materiality of public life and redistribution. But if we look at Honneth himself and at his major book concerning recognition, there he proposes as one of the aspects that make the subjectivity formation within society complicated, he speaks about the vulnerability as an aspect of subjective formation and as of something that makes it super difficult and super hard to participate in the public debate and to present themselves publicly. So here, already within the critical theory discourse, there is at least one author who puts the results of domestic violence, because he explicitly says it, that one of the key aspects of this vulnerability and impossibility of fully enjoying the participation in the public sphere is actually being harmed within domestic violence conflicts. So this is a revolutionary moment within the history of philosophy, I would say, because it has never happened before. In the major theories of democracy, of liberal democracy, of debate, whatever, of the public, this version of vulnerability didn't appear. I believe that Honneth was inspired by Judith Butler, with whom he cooperates since like 10 or 15 years. So there is a constant exchange between the two of them. Specifically, Butler goes to Frankfurt every second year or something to give public lectures, but also to work with Honneth directly. So I think in this exchange we have this concept of precarity, and that's Judith Butler writes about, and an intersection of this concept, this vision of precarity and the classical subject theory from critical school, and these two kind of combined give us the concept of vulnerability as one of those conditions of impossibility of participation in the public. Habermas himself, in the introduction to the American version of his book concerning the public sphere, he also here, I believe, he makes a reference to Carol Pateman. So Carol Pateman is another feminist author who, discussing not so much Habermas, but rather the older theorists, classical theorists of democracy, such as Rousseau, Locke and others, she makes the point that it is not possible to keep the division between public and private anymore, precisely because of domestic violence and other forms of alienation of women within the public, within the private, then influencing the impossibilities for women. There is also the debate from the 80s between, in the context of discursive ethics, the debate between Habermas and Carol Gilligan. And here Habermas behaves, I think, in a nasty way, simply. He is a very bad discussant, because he discusses with Carol Gilligan like as if she was essentializing the gender division, so like as if she thought that from a certain body a certain social character comes up, which is not true. So he starts the debate basically with accusing her of that, so later on we don't believe in Carol Gilligan anymore if we know her only from what he writes. So basically Carol Gilligan's argument was against Kohlberg and also against Habermas, and it was within the discussion concerning the stages of the ethical development. So Kohlberg's major work from 1970 was basically published in 72, okay, but the research was done in 1970. He would measure the stages of human moral behavior, assuming in the end that the key and the, let's say, top position for this moral development and adulthood, we might also say, consists on being able to rationally take a decision, which for him is actually to detach from the environment and take the autonomous decision regardless of whatever context we are situated in. And this is a very simple version of the bigger argument, of course. So Carol Gilligan, being his student, and I believe later his wife or at least partner, but this is kind of tricky history of like Gilligan and Kohlberg, they had a relationship afterwards, so this is tricky how these start, but she made her own research to contradict this theory and to say that there are at least a half of the human population who are socialized in a different way than men. So she meant women basically, and her point was that within the socialization to become a woman, let's say, many human subjects are being taught to behave and take decisions in a larger context of their relationships, of their social context, of their embodiment, of their family and kinship relations, etc., etc. So this was a debate over social psychology, but then Habermas joins this debate in the discussion over ethics. And there his point basically is of not acknowledging that Carol Gilligan already thinks about gender rather than sex. So he basically accuses her of still essentially thinking of women as certain embodiments rather than women as social critics. So basically he still misunderstands the role of cultural and social formation of gender, etc., etc. So I would say, I mean, okay, in the 1990, with the occasion of the American edition of his book, he takes into consideration the existence of feminist critiques, but this is not enough for most of the feminist critiques. There is no major transformation in the concept of subjectivity and subject formation in his writings after 1990. This would be my answer to that, and I'm not saying I'm objective reason. So no, domestic violence doesn't count. Because it is a part of the private, and because Habermas believes that strict division between the public and the private is the basis for any democratic public opinion and opinion making in the public sphere. And this is basically because for him the possibility of having private opinions is a liberty that shouldn't be given up. So he, I would say, confuses the liberty of having individualized private opinions with having to be submitted to violent treatment within the home, which are kind of different things, I would say. But for him, the liberty of having the private opinions is intrinsically intertwined with a certain closure of the household from any public concern whatsoever. So there is an essentialization and idealization, I would say, of the private realm. I don't know if this answers to the question, and I believe there could be a huge lecture done to the details of what I tried to explain in a rather short version.
The question about responsibility. If I understand your question well, I think that we can read this book of Habermas as a, I would say, call for public participation of both intellectuals and citizens. But I also think that we have in sociology, you know, this particular field, better traditions lately. Mainly, I think of so-called public sociology, and Habermas is not a part of it, I would say. Mm-hmm. I forgot the main representative of the no, Senate is, I would say, a little old-fashioned already. Mm-hmm. He was a president of the International Sociological Association. I have no connection at the moment, but I can give some marks in
okay, but I believe
hour,
that but I believe that the question was basically about the responsibilities within the public. So I believe you were asking about also methods and institutionalized forms of restricting the participation in the public, or I'm curious what the responsibility might mean in this context, and I believe this was also Przemysław's concern.
About Habermas, does he have any rules that he declares about public sphere and citizen in this public sphere? So is it important for him to take responsibility to discuss and to
I think this is a quite optimistic vision of the public sphere, basically. I mean, at least in this book, because later, in his later books concerning ethics and deliberative ethics, for instance, there we have the strict rules about what is still a debate, what is a discussion, what is a consensus, and the norms come together with the concept of the not compromise, but of the content, not consent. Sorry. So I'm sorry for that. So there comes a whole body of normative restrictions, but it is in the later books. So on the stage of this book, I believe he has a very hippie-style belief in the possibility of peaceful communication, probably coming from this post-war realization that nothing like this can ever happen anymore. We all learned our lesson, etc., etc. So in history, there is no possibility of a repetition of this kind of violent drama. So we have to be able to discuss, debate, and all that.
He understands it more in a way of civic obligation, but no obligation in metaphorical way. I would say that there's now the participation is some kind of indicator of the quality of the public sphere. And the historical moment we reconstructed here was in some way the ideal moment. And now we have some kind of what we call Verfallsgeschichte. How is it in English?
I have no clue. I absolutely have no clue. But I believe that also a more normative stance of Habermas concerns the institutions and the private capital. So this is where he puts the normative axis in this book. So the individual is not depicted. I couldn't say what would be the restrictions of the individuals, whereas the responsibility of the public media, even of the private media, of private capital, etc., and especially a critical narrative concerning how those liberties and rights are being broken by the commodification and commodifying aspect of capital. This is his axis on the level of this first big book that he publishes. And later it becomes also an issue of the participants of the public sphere. But on this stage we are sort of lucky not to have any restrictions whatsoever, because it's the bad capital or the bad institutions that restrict our natural goodness, I would say even. So I would somehow ironically speak of this book as an extremely optimist one in terms of human nature and the capacities that we have as citizens to construct the public.
Public sphere in his terms is always a product, I would say, of a specific tension between private and public, between two various meanings of interest, private interest and public interest.
So the only restrictions come from this concept, this crucial concept of rational subjects. So here there are some sets for normative stances that are being developed by Habermas in the later books. So a rational human being is a being that he takes the concept of rationality from Locke, from Kant. I think these would be the two main references. A little bit from Hegel maybe, but generally it's Locke and Kant. So for Locke explained the rational being as the one that can be held responsible for his actions. So this is the legal term, and this is how Locke himself presents it in his main books. Is that we take, I quote, we take the concept of rational being from the legal context, from the lawyer's cancellery. That's how he builds it. So this is a rational human being is a person who can be held responsible for their actions. So this is definitely, and also this is a person who can explain what those actions are and why they are committed. So there is an explanatory mode which requires a capacity of using the language in a restricted way. So this excludes any emotional and affective impacts. So this excludes any human being who is basically not shaped in a European way by education, by class and social norms, etc., etc. So this is a restrictive, I would say this is a super restrictive thing. Another thing is that, as I said, only the property owning allows you to enter the public sphere. So from that comes a responsibility. But this is also a responsibility, I would say, for those others who have not the property. But also there is a... Yeah, I wouldn't, I think it's difficult. I mean, this is a super big restriction as of the participation within the public, but it couldn't possibly be analyzed as a responsibility issue. It's a restriction simply. So otherwise than that, yeah.
Actually, in this context, because you criticize the writings of Habermas as being both, in a way, male-centric and Europe-centric. And another critique that comes to a lot of political thinkers is also their kind of presentism, as if, because the concept of public sphere with Habermas, it is present in ancient Greece, maybe a little bit in Rome, and then there's a huge, long black hole in history, and it comes back in modernity. But where is at all the definition of public and private and the possibility to conduct public life between these two periods?
You're asking about Habermasian writings, or
well, either within or his critiques that try to find other places in history where you can find the sources of behavior.
I don't know the answer because I'm not familiar with, you know, I think you're thinking of historical writings, historian critics, or sociological oriented?
Because Habermas is sociological oriented, but he makes a sort of historical sociology, right? He tries to analyze it in a historical point of view. But he does miss a huge period of history, so where is the writer that tries to find, if there is at all, maybe nobody thinks that there was something like this, somebody that tries to find evidence of public life, of participation in between.
So there's, for instance, a very interesting text by Michel Foucault, who tries to answer the same question that Kant tried to answer some 200 years previously, which is what is enlightenment. So in this text, Michel Foucault traces back the little publics of rebellious nuns, I would say. So he speaks about the Beguines, for instance, as an intellectual, a specific convent that for a while is actually a kind of avant-garde of the Roman Church, but then it becomes a field of extremely violent repression. So those nuns who gather in those convents a little bit outside of the cities, but yet still having their kind of publicness in the sense of having a debate over the Bible, over the meanings of religion and its aspects, whatever. These nuns, they create a form of public debate as Foucault tries to analyze it. On the yet another hand, for Habermas, I believe, and for theorists of the post-Weberian origin, the post-Hegelian also origins, the specifically modern European institutions, such as states, such as the distinction between the whatever executive, legislative, and jurisdiction, the legal measurements that have been introduced in the 17th century for the first time in several countries at least, to protect the individual. These are the conditions sine qua non for a proper public. So Foucault and other authors who try to go beyond the 17th century in history to cover specifically this gap that you mentioned as non-present in Habermas, they are rebellious in a sense of a whole sociological tradition of analysis of modernization. So the problem is not so much, I think, in Habermas himself, but it's rather a whole intellectual formation which prioritizes a certain set of forms of the state, of the law, of their interaction, of education, of the class system, etc., etc. So in order to cover those super interesting times, I would say, for me, for instance, the Shakespearean theater is a super interesting thing. There is beforehand Molière, there are several other theater makers that collect a form of public. So they could be analyzed, I think, as an early version of public or as a proto-version of public or whatever. But this requires a very serious debate on a general level of why we would still call this a public. There is another problem with how the antiquity is actually dealt as a time where the public sphere appears. Which happens, I mean, in Hannah Arendt, this is a very strong...
there's a book about 13th century Muslim public sphere. I forgot the author, but I can recall it and send you this by email if you're interested. But this is only one which is put in totally different context, you know, in a culturally and from a historical point of view. I don't know other ones.
So we are sort of enslaved by the theories of modernization context, I believe. I mean, this is just now starting to happen, the revisions of modernism and modernity on one hand, but also the revised visions of the Middle Ages, for instance, and how they would be interesting from the point of view of similarities between the bourgeois public sphere and other institutions. But I believe that this is just starting to happen, because the general paradigm, also sociological paradigm especially, is super strongly preoccupied with the novelty of the liberties of the individual that are granted by the state. There is this dialectic between individual and the social and the political. You mentioned. Any other remarks, comments, voices? Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, maybe you mentioned it in your lecture, and I a little bit missed it, got lost in the translation in my head, but what is so innovative in the public sphere concept of Habermas comparing to existing concept before from Hegel, from civil society, and from civil society by, what is the name of the French author with the civil society in America, democracy in America? Yes, sorry, yes, I forgot. So.
No, I think that we could read Habermas as a post-Hegelian, but it would be a simplicity reading, I would say, because in Hegel's writing, the tension between the family and British society was overcome within the state structures, you know, and the public sphere is beyond the state structures, and it is a crucial difference between, you know, these both concepts. They are not the same, and the novelty of Habermas is that he thinks about human interest that occurs between private and public, and these interests are not fulfilled in a state structure, I would say.
I couldn't hear. I don't know if we already discussed this one, but if I mean, a lot of this stuff recalls like many other. I mean, this is obviously 40, 50 years ago, whatever. But in the context of what's like happening with social media or a whole new formation of different public spheres, I guess. Did you already discuss something along these lines? I was just curious how. I guess, I mean, there are just so many things that counter Habermas's, I guess, notion in a way, in terms of what's happening now.
Can you please enumerate those things that are...
I don't know, I just feel there's like a whole new book that I
Mm-hmm.
could probably be like, hey Habermas, check this out.
Mhm.
Like,
Okay,
these
but
things
can you
are-
enumerate the ones
I
that
mean,
seems super
especially
technical?
because I was interested last week when you mentioned like pay specific attention to the commodification or all these things like mass media, etc. in Habermas. It's interesting because I actually read Habermas earlier in the context of some of the art history class, which has nothing to do with considering it from the mass media perspective. So it was interesting, really, to focus on that. But then there was a moment where that made me realize that's really against a lot of things now, how we see mass media, or I mean, how mass media now, specifically social media, helps form. I mean, I guess practical examples would be like the Egyptian revolution or all these things, obviously, but where does the clash between the body of the state, obviously, versus the mass come back in again in a different form? I don't know.
I'm super curious because on one hand we should have a sociological data concerning the participants of the Arabic Spring or of the events in Egypt you mentioned. So it's
I mean, I actually feel bad, like something odd about that example because I know it's from the perspective of those people. It was never a Facebook revolution or things like this. But I guess, I mean, it could be Ukraine as well. If you put it that way. I mean, I just want to make sure that there's no distinction. I didn't mean specifically to give Arab example.
But the thing is that actually when you were mentioning all those texts in Polish that have been an interesting great interpretation of the Polish history, let's say, or elements of the Polish public theorizing the public sphere in the Polish context, I was thinking very intensively of Elżbieta Matynia, whom I mentioned in the last seminar, and I would like to repeat this mentioning again. And we're gonna, I mean, she's on our syllabus. I'm trying to invite her to Poland, but this semester she cannot do it, so hopefully maybe next fall. So Elżbieta Matynia, as I mentioned, I believe already, tried to use Habermas's concept of the public sphere to discuss Solidarność movement in 1980 specifically, and early 1980s, so the first Solidarność as we call it, right? So in this, so what happens in her analysis is that on one hand, Solidarność is analyzed not just as a social movement, but also as a transformation of the public, which is an interesting twist, because in the previous writings it was basically data analysis, so it was rather like far less qualitative than quantitative analysis, if I may say. There was, of course, Stanisky's with her theory of self-restricting revolution, and but these were not conceptually powerful. I mean, they were in the 80s, but now when we read it, I believe it's a little bit kind of passé. But with Matynia it's different, because looking at Solidarność at a social movement, as a form of transformation of the public is interesting, and of course there is a whole body of salons, of meetings, of whatsoever. But on the other hand, if we read, when we read Matynia, and actually she herself is conscious of that, the problem of, for instance, the majority of the Solidarność members being proletarians rather than bourgeois is complicated. Because the criteria for rational being, for instance, which are so super crucial in Habermas, as we tried, hopefully, to emphasize, these criteria are not met. These are people, on the other hand, whatever happens within Solidarność happens in the Gdańsk shipyard, in the Ursus factories, in the metal factories in Nowa Huta, in the shipyards in Szczecin, in workplaces. These are not the fields which are anyhow analyzed by Habermas. He is actually quite explicitly cutting off the possibility of ever anything happening as a public sphere in this kind of places. Also, the streets of mainly the so-called Arab Springs, I know the controversy and the kind of patronizing character. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the discussion concerning the name Arab Spring, but generally there are several authors, for instance, publishing the New Left Review, who nowadays critically refer to the name Arab Spring being a patronizing name given by the Europeans and the Westerners to the Arabs, who are always a little bit backwards, as this racist narrative emphasizes. So now the Arabic countries entering a intense form of public debate is treated as a spring, like as if they were, I don't know, dormant throughout the ages. So basically this is a part of the argument of the articles from the summer issue of the New Left Review. So if anybody is interested, please look for that, or I can also help to find it. So there is a whole discussion about that. But so already here there is a problem of like Westerners looking at their others. I believe this also applies to Poland, and this also applies to Ukraine. So I believe that if we take the concept, Habermas's concept, there is an issue of who is the rational subject, and whether we can speak, for instance, about the non-Westerners as being the rational subjects as Habermas imagines them. So there is a work to be done either on the level of accomplishing Habermas's task after him somehow and correcting, let's say, this concept of rationality. But then we enter straight away the debate with Kant and Hegel, and we have corrected them. And that's a problematic issue, at least. Then there is also the problem of participation of women, who are super important, I would suggest, in the Solidarność movement, in the Maidan events, and I believe also in the Arab Springs. Then there is the issue of the bourgeoisie. So what kind of bourgeoisie is in the Arab countries, what kind of bourgeoisie, and whether we do have a bourgeois participation in the Maidan. This was something I tried to investigate a little bit, because this is interesting. I mean, there are several social classes or social groups that have been involved in the Maidan. For instance, there were the participants of the Maidan events are emphasizing the presence of the taxi drivers, who were, I believe, partly Russian origins, and who were making this auto-Maidan part of the events, which was crucial in protecting the seat-inners in the center of the square. So these are some kind of proto-bourgeois social formation. On the other hand, they don't have, or they haven't had before Maidan, a clear representation within the public sphere. They wouldn't, before Maidan, I think, speak in one voice, although the history of taxi drivers in Ukraine is not my specialty. Maybe I don't know something, but I assume they wouldn't exist as a social body. And plus, this is just a professional similarity, and not a kind of big class like bourgeoisie in Habermas. So there are issues like this. So my suggestion is, and this is a kind of leitmotif of this seminar, that we can actually try to work on the concept of the public sphere. So to start there and try to transform it. But the problem is that those transformations of the concept of the public sphere as a transformation of the public, and here I'm redundant and this is by purpose, this operation has to work on several levels. So there is the issue of rational subject that has to be discussed. There is an issue of prejudices hidden in the very Habermas's concept. So in discussing Solidarność, I tried to look at the theory of Kluge and Knecht. And there I don't see, we discussed it last time, I believe, partly with you. I think you were asking about the experience in Kluge and Knecht, right? And then, so I suggested that everybody is understood still as bourgeoisie, because there is no recognition whatsoever as to how the specific workplace conditions shape the forms of participation in the public of the workers. Kluge and Knecht sort of forget that those guys, they are actually not sitting in any salons or whatever other places, or parliaments or newspaper editorial houses, but they are in factories. So their communication, their deliberation, their debates are shaped by a very different strategies. For instance, I don't know if when the decision is being taken on the 14th of August 1980 to go on strike, this decision is not being taken by a rational debate. You know, Wałęsa doesn't sit with Henryka Krzywonos and Anna Walentynowicz to debate, you know, the vision of the police and how the police should be transformed. They basically say, okay, we have had enough, we go on strike. That's the narrative, more or less. Then Wałęsa says, no, maybe not today, and then Krzywonos goes like, what, not today? And that's a kind of family quarrel style. I mean, if we analyze the discourse of those exchanges, so when you say Arab Spring and Facebook, for instance, or Arab Spring, and there is also a very specific discussion that happens. So we would need, I think, and this would mean on one hand following Habermas, on the other hand contradicting Habermas, because we would follow Habermas, I think, if we carefully analyzed the kind of exchanges, discursive patterns and debates that happen in order to produce the protests in the Arabic countries. So in this we follow Habermas, I think, and this is quite an interesting following, which he might not like so much, but I don't really care. That's not his role to accept whatever people do with his concept, right? So there is a certain liberty, luckily in the social sciences still, to take the liberty of developing a notion. So, but we would have to do that, actually. And this is something that people who promise us to produce, for instance, an analysis of counterpublics in terms of proletarian contemporary, they do not do it. They do not follow specifically the narrative, for instance, of the workers' leaflets from the 19th century to discuss the proletarian publics. And this is a moment when I find the difficulty with understanding Kruger and Knecht as fulfilling the promise of producing a theory of the proletarian public. But we're going to get to them and discuss them in detail. There is also Nancy Fraser, whom we have read. Nancy Fraser speaks about the subaltern counterpublics, right? So she is also a theorist who might be useful for specifically non-Western contexts of transformations of the public. But I don't know, I mean, there are some problems with that also, because, for instance, all those events that we mentioned, so maybe not so Danish, but Maidan and Arabic Spring definitely fall into that category. These are kind of rebellious moments within a larger history. These are relatively short moments of 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, you know, short time events. So I'm not sure if the concept of public sphere, which, as we see in the examples discussed by Habermas, they are long-term processes. It's like the creation of the theatrical public, 150 years, a creation of a philosophical concept, 200 years. These are huge time intervals. So I would think about whether this discrepancy between those hundreds of years sometimes and this 1, 2, 3 years, what we do with those. Again, I'm positive, and I think everything is to be done over here, but there is also the issue of violence. I mean, at a certain point, the Solidarność workers are rebelling in a violent way. At a certain point, the Arabic Spring is a violent set of events, in parts, in particular moments, but still. In the Maidan, there are some moments when the Maidan protesters actually recur to violence. So I believe in Habermas it would already be exceeding the concept of the public debate. As for me, I'm not exactly sure if this is a condition sine qua non. So I would demythologize the issue of violence in discussing that, but it's also one of the strategies.
Because I wanted to continue Angela's question and your remarks on it, because for me it seems that these discrepancies are a little bit, let's say, methodological, because what you presented is that Habermas gives a set of preconditions for public spheres, certain freedoms, economic conditions, etc. And you gave us a couple of counter examples that show that sometimes even without these preconditions, public sphere somehow explodes, and you can find exchange of ideas for the public good, even in the most restrictive societies with no bourgeoisie, no property, etc. So perhaps, and I'm thinking of a researcher like Marsh with this theory of public participation. There is a certain need for writing the methodology of public sphere research. So, for example, researching the state of every society when it comes to the preconditions and how public sphere is expressed in such societies. So, for example, giving the expression of the public sphere, whether, for example, violent or non-violent, developed or underdeveloped, although these concepts of developed and underdeveloped are a little bit problematic, as sort of dependent variables, and the preconditions of Habermas as independent variables. Is there such a methodological attempt?
We are just starting. I think this is just starting, and I believe I've seen a lot of enthusiasm in Ukrainian colleagues of mine when I proposed to analyze the Maidan in terms of the public sphere. This was taken enthusiastically, because otherwise people would think, oh, there are some nationalistic patriots or protesting against the super positive Russians and the interconnection between the Ukraine and Russia as such, or some masses, masses in the square. So basically this category, this super conservative category of masses would actually pacify. So this, I mean, the paradox of Ukraine is super huge actually, because it's the left, the Western left, who look at the Maidan using conservative categories. So it's like masses took over the Maidan and are quarreling about we don't know what. I mean, sorry for bringing this kind of super simplistic shortcut. I mean, quote of some of the journals in the radical left in the West and in the US. But this was sometimes the reception of the events actually, and this is on one hand colonial, because it's not looking into the postulates of anybody. This means also the use of the category of masses actually does not allow to see the people gathered in the Maidan Square as rational subjects. So the neglect and the, I mean, with the Arab Spring, once I compared the Ukrainian events and its reception in the left with the Arab Spring, and this is super fascinating, because there is a huge wave of enthusiasm towards the Arab Spring in the Western press, Western leftist press especially. So this is welcomed as a, you know, preceding the Occupy Wall Street, as a wonderful progressive set of events, etc., etc. And that's cool, but it's not specific enough. It's not taking into consideration the political affiliations of the people who are gathered there. It's not seriously considering and analyzing the postulates that have been enumerated by all the protesters, etc., etc. So it's an over-enthusiastic colonial gaze, I would say, or expression of colonial gaze. Like they also can be rebellious. They are almost like us, etc., etc. So there are projections and this kind of patronizing whatever images. And then there is Ukraine and the events in Ukraine, and there is this hurrah pessimistic, I would say, reception on the left of whatever happens in Maidan, of Western left. And there are, I would say, sometimes the same arguments but reversed, applied to the Maidan. So like in the Arab Springs events, everybody is every person protesting on the streets is basically a super progressive, wonderful democratic creature. So everybody protesting in Ukraine is a nationalistic, totalitarian, whatever, pro-capitalist, whatever, someone like that. So there is a massive misunderstanding, I would say, but also a massive negligence towards the accuracy of the statements about the two events. So them put together are showing how, on one hand, I would say how impermeable still the concept of public sphere and public debate is when it comes to non-European or non-Western countries. And several other things that are also pertinent there, like, I don't know, like an overdose. I mean, I would say these are two examples of like colonial attitudes towards the two. So I would suggest that we can develop theories of the public sphere also in other places than the Western countries, but this should proceed with caution, and those supposedly negligible methodological shifts are actually crucial for the outcome, I think. I mean, and I would very strongly defend that. Because the issue of violence, it has to be solved, whether the communication process can actually happen within the violence situation and violent communication. This is a crucial question, and it changes our perspective towards, I mean, if we accept the presence of violence within the democratic process, then it has implications on every level. It has implications towards our normative ideals of how the democracy should look like. Because if we accept citizens throwing things on each other, we should accept also policemen throwing things on others, for instance. So this is an implication that cannot be, I mean, a theory neglecting this issue of violence and neglecting the necessity of situating this aspect of social life and also diagnosing it, but also giving a normative stance, I think would be very weak. And weak because of the possible consequences or implications that we don't see, that we do not foresee, and then they torpedo our concept. Yeah? So if we want, for instance, defend the Arabic Spring as a democratic event, and at the same time we accept violence as a normal element of deliberation, we might have some funny implications by the end of of our article, if I may say. I mean, this has to be done with caution. I mean, if somebody wants to defend or if somebody wants to say, I would say it would be a repercussion of Bourdieu, for instance, right? That the symbolic violence is present constantly, so that there are always excluded within any social strata, and that the privilege, the economic privilege, the symbolic privilege, social privilege, is actually a violent form of segregation. This can be a defense of some, at least some forms of violent communication that maybe is, yeah, but I don't know. I mean, I think this should be considered with extra caution. What do we do? Do we have more questions, or you didn't speak? You and you. Any specific comment or?
I like one of the examples mentioned earlier about a theater or an opera where people watch and then it turns into a discussion on a variety of levels, and strong emotions are born, and then it may result in some physical action. And I thought this is one of the ideas that Habermas brings as the moment where public sphere was being born. And then we get to the point that we discussed here of violence-less and very rational discussion. Maybe it was a mistake to completely eliminate violence, and by connection, emotion in this public sphere. I think the role of emotion is especially something that Habermas made a mistake to completely overlook.
I think this comes with the whole packet of tradition, of philosophical tradition where Habermas comes from. So this exclusion of emotions is basically Rousseau's, as I said about, Rousseau's statement about women, is that we should protect our society and civilization from the disorder of women, he said. Disorder of women means precisely that they are super over-agitated and they can basically be a threat to the public order.
His interest is to get rid of emotions, and
we can
see it as a limitation, and it is a limitation of his theory, I think. But according to you, Eva, I think that we should also work on one more tool and connect the public sphere concept with some imagination on I think, social movements, and linked these two concepts, public sphere and new social movement. Not new, because new social movements are not that new nowadays. I think the tradition from the 80s. But we need to link it, I think. And there's a way, I think, of classical articles or papers by Konarato or even Mary Hansen, who wrote the introduction to Van Nachts, and she directly links the public sphere and social movements. Old social movement, as a proletarian movement, and some kind of feminist shift to, and so on. I think that the public sphere is not enough to describe these processes accurately. But that's my opinion.
There is also a very interesting essay of Seyla Benhabi concerning the Kohlberg and Gilligan debate, and the exclusions of femininity, but also of any form of otherness. I'm just now thinking about the title of this, but